So the question was, if you didn't hear it, it sounds like unionism and syncretism are two different things. And you explained unionism being, let's see, that would be with people of the Christian faith but different faiths, and syncretism with different religions. Is that what you said?
Well, you asserted that they're synonymous, correct?
Correct, I did.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know where I was taught this, but I was taught it pretty clearly, and I pretty much thought it was orthodox that syncretism is a falsely gathering or associating with world religions, and unionism was falsely gathering, associating with Christian denomination.
Right, and so I was taught that too, but not really taught. It's kind of what I caught. It's what I assumed. And when I did historical research on this, I had to go back to the German, first off, to see what does the German Constitution of the Missouri Synod say. I was at the Historical Institute, by the way, when I was doing this research. So I went back to the original minutes of the Constitution meeting in 1917 when they adopted the English version of the German Constitution. There was no discussion on this topic. There was some on other topics about clarification. So the assumption was by the delegates that the English was a perfect translation of the German. So the difference in the, it's in my notes. Let's see. I want to make sure I get this right, especially since it's being recording. Let's see. In the German, it says Glaubensmengerei. That means mixing of doctrine. Glaube is faith or doctrine, but here it means doctrine. Or Kirchenmengerei, which means church. So what the Synod's original constitution prohibited was those two things. That is, the mixing of doctrines or the mixing of churches. I'm pretty sure this is correct. Let me double check. Yeah. And then, so then the problem is that syncretism and unionism doesn't really fit that distinction. One doesn't refer just to doctrine and the other just to church. Maybe that was what the people who approved the English version thought, but you have to understand that 1917, we were in the middle of World War I, and they were ready to adopt anything that made them look English. And I can tell you, because my grandmother, when my grandmother grew up in a German-speaking only home, she went to school and learned English. It was Missouri Synod. So my grandmother, once I got to know, when she got angry, she was saying all these words, auf Deutsch. So I took German in high school to learn what all these words she was saying. And once she found out that I knew German, that all stopped. If you understand what I'm saying. But so it isn't that far away. So Grandma was born in 1900. She was a teenager in 1917, but her mom and dad would not let her speak English at home. When they adopted it, I don't think that all the delegates at the 1917 convention knew the nuances of English language. They thought this was good enough. And I think that the committee that adopted it was trying to be fair. So we shouldn't try to read into whatever their immediate need was. And that's why I did the work that I did. There is another study that I've put into my footnote done by Jerry Bodie. This is footnote number 4. You can go to that footnote, and I have a web link. If you type it in correctly, you should get the paper that he did. Jerry Bodie, by the way, is the professor of church history dealing with American Lutheran history at the St. Louis Seminary today. He's a very good professor. He did a very competent job on the question of what is the meaning of these terms? What's the historical background for all these terms in the history of the Missouri Synod? And I've read through that paper several times, and almost all of it's correct, but there's a few things I disagree with. I think he made some errors. But they're not, don't go bad-mouthing Bodie. He did a great job for this. It's just a difficult thing sometime to get the nuances of terms right when you translate from one language to the other. So my answer to your question is, based on our history and how those terms entered the Constitution, they mean the same thing. They mean the mixing of religion. And if we understand the original Constitution, mixing of religion either in terms of mixing doctrine or mixing of congregations. And that's what the terms originally mean. Now, how did we end up with this understanding today? If you go to example for the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church or the Oxford Dictionary of Religion, the term syncretism is in there. And it talks about the mixing of religions. Specifically, Christian and Jewish, Christian and Muslim, because that's how the term is normally used in the United States. The term unionism is not in those dictionaries. It's in the Lutheran Encyclopedia, and there they try to define it. The unionism comes out of our own history of the Missouri Synod, which I gave you, with the immigrants that were in Germany protesting the Prussian Union, called the merger of those two churches, they called it unionism because it was called the Prussian Union. The term syncretism goes back in its various language forms all the way to the 17th century with three different controversies, and they called that the syncretistic controversy. But the syncretistic controversies were again about the merger of Lutherans and Reformed, that is, Lutherans and Calvinists. So it's the same thing if you do the historical study. Thank you, Tim, and you can ask more.
Yeah, I just have one follow-up. I'm just really surprised a juvenile Martin Noland didn't know what Scheistikov meant.
I was so innocent.
Question.
Pastor Alexander Lang, Albany, Oregon. Thank you. I thought the very interesting paper. I was especially interested to learn about what was going on in the 1930s. I wasn't aware of that. I was taught it. I forgot it. So thank you for that. I'm kind of curious, you were talking specifically about what that missionary had done and what happened with the convention. And you made the point that at this convention, suddenly it seemed that quite a large portion of our synod was suddenly forgetting our stance on syncretism, or was willingly turning their back on our stance that this starting to take place in the 1930s. I'm just kind of curious to know, in your opinion, obviously syncretism has always been a temptation for the church, and especially in our context, our American context, ever since rationalism and so forth. But was there anything specifically going on in the early 1900s that you would point to that you would say, this is the reason why this generation of Lutherans was more willing to reconsider our stance on syncretism and turn our back on our Constitution?
Yeah, good. Excellent question. Did you understand the question? Is early 1900s, so probably leading up to 35 or the 45 statement, what might be the causes of why the synod started drifting away? It wasn't all at once. Brooks is the first thing that shows up in the history. So why did that happen? Because this is important for trying to understand the issues we face as Lutherans in America. Let me say that again. Lutherans in America. Those two don't fit. Okay? You got to understand about America is we are the most syncretistic nation in the world. Look at the history of religions and what's tolerated and what's where. We are the most syncretistic company anywhere. The Yankee Stadium is just part of the civil religion. So how do we be Lutherans? And by Lutheran, we understand to mean not just that we're Scandinavian and German, but that we actually have a doctrinal base. How do we do that? Well, this is a problem that just hasn't affected the Missouri Synod. It's affected all the Lutherans. It's just that we have been the most resistant because we're German and we're stubborn. I'm German, I can say that. I'm also Scotch-Irish, and so I'm stubborn any way you look at me. No, I'm just kidding. Part of the reason that the Missouri Synod was insulated from this problem for so long and people just accepted it is because we were separated by language. Our forefathers refused to accept English. In fact, to the point that they did not really accept English people into their congregation. I mean, they may have done so formally, but not really welcomed them, or English-speaking pastors. When they got people that decided they were going to, they agreed with our theology, but couldn't speak English, they formed a separate synod called the English Synod. Are you aware of that? The pastors might remember that from their Lutheran church history. So this was before World War I. So because we were insulated or isolated from the American realm, including religion, the temptation to merge or to do things together didn't happen, because the stuff that was happening on the Thanksgiving Day service among the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Baptists was all in English. And the German pastor would go out there and he'd try to speak German, and they'd say, "Who is that? Who invited him? He can't even speak English." I'm serious. This is what the historians of the Lutheran Church have concluded. And once we moved in the transition from German to English, and our pastors became familiar with English and very conversant with it, that's when the problem started happening. Because then you could invite a Missouri Synod guy and he would speak and preach in English. And so why not? So it's really the language thing that kept us apart for so long. World War I forced most of our congregations to go to English. As I said, the 1917 was the first year that the convention of the Synod was held in English, and the Constitution was, an equivalent Constitution was adopted in that year. So it's after 1917, with the increasing use of English and more pastors coming out of the seminary who are very fluent in English, and then the merger of the English Synod into the English district, that then we have this issue where, oh, we're just like the rest because we're not German anymore. This is what most church historians explain. I think it's a good explanation. You could also ask the question of, for example, Larry Rast, who is, I think, our best expert on Lutheran Church in America. I think he would say pretty much the same thing. That doesn't solve the problem, but it helps us understand why we were so delayed in getting into this problem. So Brooks was just the tip of the iceberg, as it were. There may have been other cases that don't end up in the history books because they said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and they apologize, and they were forgiven, and it didn't end up in the history books. Brooks said, "I'm right, and I'm going to take down the Missouri Synod president because I'm right," and he did take down Pfotenhauer. That's why Pfotenhauer was not reelected, because he got involved in that case. It's a problem in the way that we've recently redone our adjudication system so that district presidents and synodical presidents can be involved in adjudication cases. This is a whole other topic. I've talked about this before. But if you allow the presidents to get involved, they will get taken down by a very stubborn person like Missionary Brooks. So if you want to keep your good presidents, keep them out of adjudication cases. That's what our history teaches us.
Question.
Now, you may not like that, but that's the way it is. That's what's to learn about the Brooks case. And the Synod did learn from that. The Synod took the adjudication powers away from the president and district presidents and formed separate boards so that they wouldn't, a person in adjudication who was a problem like Brooks wouldn't be able to take down or make sure that a district president or synod president wasn't reelected. So we've been dealing with that. I mean, the gentleman said since the 1930s, we've been dealing with this problem back and forth. So it's not just in my lifetime. It's not just in anybody's lifetime here. It's our grandparents' lifetime that Missouri Synod has been fighting over this. So thank you. Go ahead.
Question.
Thank you, Dr. Noland. I'm looking at page 7 in your paper. Walther writing to Ernst. My desires concerning this matter are chiefly these: one, that in addition to the Word of God, the Synod be founded on all the confessions of our Church, and then particularly this phrase, including, if possible, the Saxon Articles of Visitation. Why specifically are the visitation articles mentioned there? And does this tie in with ecclesiastical supervision?
Yeah, good point. So he asked on page 7, it's Walther's letter to Adam Ernst, who was also a pastor, that he wanted to have that the Word of God and the confessions be our norm, and also in that paragraph to include the Saxon Articles of Visitation. Well, they didn't put the Saxon Articles of Visitation into the confession section of our first Constitution, but they did put the matter of visitation in the latter portion of the Constitution. And this was a very important part of the president's job and the district president's job as of 1854 when you formed districts. And that basically visitation was that there was like a supervisor that would show up at your church and would sit down with the pastor and with the elders and find out what you're doing in worship and are you complying with the Synod Constitution. And if you were, then he'd pat you on the back and say, keep up the good work and go to the next congregation. This was in detail in the Synod's Constitution. I don't know when it dropped out. It may have still been in the early versions of the English Constitution. And it included at the end as appendices. So they were really part of the Constitution, bylaws of the Synod, an actual set of questions or outline for the visitors, that is for the synodical or district president. Now today we have people called circuit visitors, and it's their job to do that, but we don't have that outline that used to be in the Synod Constitution, and we don't follow the Saxon Articles. I don't really know how the circuit visitors do their stuff. I've never been one. I don't know if it's changed, but I will say this, that when President Harrison was elected, or prior to his election, and in part of that, he wanted to get the Synod back to visitation. And the reason he and I had discussions about this is because it's right here. It's in the letter it's the originating idea. What's the Missouri Synod going to be? Walther to Ernst includes the Saxon Articles, and it's in the early constitutions, all the way probably up until the 20th century. That visitation was the way in which the Synod would keep track of what's going on in the congregations among the pastors. So Harrison's, if you remember his first term, he was really big on visitation. It's one of the reasons we changed the name from circuit counselor to circuit visitor. After that, it went to the Council of Presidents. And I don't know where it's gone since then. But this is the reason why it's there. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Dr. Noland, thank you. Brilliant as always. I would take exception with one thing that you said. You mentioned some guy about being a great theologian or a historian with American church history, and the best church historian that we have in the Missouri Synod is also a parish pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in San Mateo, California. Because, and I mean that, because you are willing to make the good confession. You are willing to make the good confession, whatever the topic is. So thank you.
Okay, how much are you getting off my credit card for me? Thank you.
Yeah.
That was very
All right, I want to.
heartfelt, and thank you.
You're welcome. Many of us mean that. Thank you. On the bottom of page 8 and top of page 9, you again, from your research, were able to point out something that I've never heard of before. With the 1938 funeral for Paul Lindemann, and with the ecumenical service regarding VE Day with Richard Kemmerer, and with those two events as precipitating events to the statement of the 44. I'm hungry for more. You said controversy ensued on each of those. I can't look up the footnotes now These are not resources that are readily available to most of us. Can you give us a little bit more detail on how big of a controversy these were in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and how disruptive they were to the status quo?
Well, I'll do the best I can. The footnotes point to Jack Robinson's PhD dissertation at Vanderbilt, 1972. And then Theodore Grebner had an article which actually looks like it was reprinted. So it's Penitent Jubilee in 1946 in the CHIQ 1972 that refers to that. So that's where I found this information, and I couldn't tell you how I traced it, but those are the original. So yeah, I would think that going to the Vanderbilt dissertation is probably the most expose, most detail on that. What I was doing was I was trying to find out what was the precipitating event for the Statement of the 44. All of our seminary students, by the way, both seminaries, learn about the Statement of the 44, which it gets confusing because it was 44 pastors in 1945, right? Did I get that right? I often said it was 45 pastors in 1944. No, don't get that mixed up. I just did. But the statement was the first time, and all of our historians note this. It even goes back to C.S. Meyer in his Moving Frontiers. And I think actually C.S. Meyer may be sympathetic to a statement. It was the first time in the Synod's history that there was a questioning of not only the ethics of fellow pastors, because it was global. It was like, you're all a bunch of legalists. That's what they said. 44 pastors said to the rest of the Synod, you're all a bunch of legalists. Now that's kind of elitist, don't you think? It was taken that way. And very dismissive. And it included a lot of leaders of the Synod, including seminary professors. Grebner himself, I think, signed on. He had been Lutheran Witness editor. I don't know if he still was. And it was very disruptive. And not only the way in which the attitude that came across, but also what was said, because it was clearly against the traditional position of the Missouri Synod on the doctrine of church fellowship and syncretism and unionism. So my question was, well, what events caused this in 1945? Now, I think that some people among our church historians said, well, this had been simmering for a while and it suddenly popped up because of the end of World War II. Well, that might be, but you know, I looked through all of the detail on this and it just didn't appear like it was simmering. There was only the Brooks case that I said it just doesn't make sense because the Brooks case was resolved by Brooks leaving the Missouri Synod. And most people said, good riddance. You'll be happier where you went. It was the University of Chicago, by the way, Divinity School. So I started digging into this and then found out that there were these other events that happened. This gives it to you. So controversy ensued means that it became known throughout the Synod. And pastors at their conferences, they didn't have blogs back then. So they talked by word of mouth. I don't think it shows up in the journals, but they were talking about it at pastoral controversies, pastoral conferences. I'm not sure that it showed up in the convention because I looked through that. But you know, Missouri Synod was a lot closer then. My mom's side of the family is Missouri Synod pastors and teachers and laymen going all the way back, and they used to communicate by letters. So as I go into my family history files, I'll find a letter from one Missouri Synod teacher to a Missouri Synod pastor, and they're talking mostly about Missouri Synod stuff. So just because they didn't put it in a journal or actually put it in the synodical convention didn't mean the people weren't talking. The people most closely related to this would be the pastors and the church workers, mostly teachers back then. And controversy ensued means that these people were talking and arguing about it. And so So that is the background to that as best as I can do at this point without going to those sources that I pointed to in the footnote. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. I want to have 2 points to ask. First is about further clarification on the Brooks matter. My understanding had always been, and I really learned something today that was important, had always been that that Pfotenhauer lost the election and Benken was installed because a group of people wanted to get Missouri out of the mud, who were stuck in the mud and wanted to get them to be a part of Americana. And I have read to the extent that that they thought Benken could be manipulated and could be influenced. Your insight that and study that Brooks had that much to do with it makes me wonder: was this all basically the same issue? Or was the syncretism thing the spark, and then there was also this other thing that they thought Missouri was old-fashioned and should get with the program? Are they all the same thing from what you see?
Okay, so I'll try to answer that question. First off, the transition from Pfotenhauer to Benken. I think we mentioned, he and I talked at lunch. John W. Benken's autobiography is called This I Recall, and last year, I believe, CPH published the second edition of that, which is very interesting for this discussion. In fact, the whole history of the Synod, because the first edition of John Bacon's This I Recall was edited, it was expurgated. And the editors at CPH took out the things they didn't like, because he said some things that weren't very nice about the St. Louis Seminary. You may be surprised about that, because it seemed like Benken had a piece of cake type of ministry. Well, yeah, but he didn't. There weren't the type of journals of discussion like we have today. So, but people still talked at pastors' conferences, and people still wrote letters. If you look at the second edition, which I think it's 2017 of This I Recall, especially the appendices that Paul McCain found with the assistance of Bill Schmelder. Bill Schmelder recently passed, God bless his soul. Bill Schmelder was professor at St. Louis after the walkout. Bill Schmelder married into the Benken family, and Bill's a good conservative. And one of the last things Bill wanted was John's own words not expurgated by CPH publishers. And Paul McCain agreed. So you look at the appendices and you'll see how John Bacon actually felt about these things. And it's the first time that I found that he didn't know how he was elected. This all happened behind his back. And as you said, they thought that they could manipulate him, but he was not so easily manipulated. But some things went out behind his back. So the first point is that Benken was not behind the move to get rid of Pfotenhauer, because Pfotenhauer was, wir stehen beim Alten. That's auf Deutsch. We're standing by the old ways. And he was a very strong conservative maintainer of what Walther and Pieper had handed down. But then you find in that appendix the 26 questions that John Bacon sent to the faculty on the issue of biblical authority, and they never answered him because he was retired. But it's published for the first time in that second edition. Because Benken, after he was retired, realized that he'd been duped by his closest associates. I won't mention the names, but they'll go down in, because they lied to the church and they put us all into this big mess. So that's the first thing. Now, the second part of this answer is the statement, if you look at it, deals with a lot of issues. You're right. The general tone was, we don't want to be stuck in the mud. But that just means we don't want to do things like we've always done them. We want change. And what were the changes that the statementarians, that's a term that's used of them, what changes do they want? Well, there really were two things. And they were not advocating a change in the doctrine of Scripture. You got to make that clear. So there, for example, was Arndt in there who wrote Bible difficulties. So everybody in there, as far as we know, at least publicly, upheld the doctrine of Scripture. What they disagreed with was the doctrine of church fellowship. Because the synod had been working since 1930, it's the same time that these other events happened with Kemmer and with Lindemann and Roy. In the 30s, the synod was having discussions to merge with the ALC, the old ALC, not the new ALC that was founded in 1960. And a lot of people thought there's not that much difference between German Lutherans of the ALC and German Lutherans of the Missouri Synod. But if you started digging, as the committee did, you'd find out, yeah, there's a whole lot of differences, especially in method, which is not the results, but it's how you get at theology. And so eventually the committee, with the assistance of Benken, said, we can't do this. We cannot approve church fellowship with the old ALC. And then, in the 1960s, most of you who were in the Missouri Synod at the time remember we did fellowship with the new ALC, but it wasn't any better. In fact, the ALC had gotten farther away. So the statement basically deals with two issues, but they're both in the area of church fellowship. One is the issue of ALC fellowship, and the other is the syncretistic position of the synod in participating in these type of events or other things. But it was really directed against the syncretism position of the Missouri Synod. And if you haven't heard that before, maybe your teachers didn't catch all that. But the documents in the Missouri Synod make this clear. So a study of that, I haven't tried to add my own interpretation. It's simply explaining what's in those documents. So you had a second question.
Second question was really more of a comment concerning this change from circuit counselor to circuit visitor. Almost everybody in the body here is younger than I am. I happen to be present in the Board of Directors meeting of the Texas District, where I was serving as pastor at the time, when the district president, Carl Heckman, explained to the board the rationale of what had been proposed and really somewhere had been decided. I don't know whether it was decided at the convention, but the change from a circuit visitor to a circuit counselor. And that a counselor has rounded edges more, that the visitor idea evokes a visitation from God, thunder and lightning, and that kind of thing. He presented that as a rationale and what the thinking was. I thought it would just be interesting to those who've never known anything else except circuit counselors, how that was changed in about 1965, 6, 7, somewhere in there.
Thank you, George. That's a good analogy, a good thing to learn about our history. Yeah, because that was about the time these things were going through. And by the way, if I didn't make clear, the American Publicity Bureau has been a leading force in the pro-ecumenical movement in the Missouri Synod. If you want to blame one organization, it's the ALPB. They're the ones. Historically, maybe not when they first got founded, but by the end of Lindemann's term, it's very clear. They just came out with an anniversary book, 50th anniversary, I think, and that's worth reading to see what their real goals and achievements were. And they've achieved a lot of their goals, but I'm trying to reverse them.